Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of the AskHistorians podcast. Today is part of the first part of our thematic two-parter on the Mongols, specifically dealing with the Mongol history you don't typically get, because most of the time when you hear Mongol history, it focuses almost entirely on Genghis, or I guess the more proper pronunciation, the more modern pronunciation, or the interpretation of the pronunciation would be Chinggis, but we're going to go with Genghis because that's what most people are familiar with. So if that throws you off, sorry. But today we're going to be talking to Rakony about the Ilkhanate, which is the western side of the southwestern side of the Mongol Empire, the part that existed in the Iran or Persia, Central Asia, parts of the Middle East, and hopefully this episode and the subsequent episode in 2 weeks focusing on the Yuan dynasty in China will really kind of fill in the gaps that a normal historical education will give you. Just a couple of show notes though. So at some point I do make reference to the Mongols building a forbidden city. That's my fault. That is completely wrong, and I will actually get corrected on that in the next episode. We do make a in-joke to the chart. If you're kind of familiar with the in-jokes of Ask Historians and Bad History, you will know about the chart. I'll put it up in the discussion post just so you can see it and marvel at its kind of Whiggish history badness. And then about 52, 53, 54 minutes in, there is a little bit of bad language. So if you have small children who have made it through the past almost hour of pillage and destruction and massacres, and you don't want them to hear a bad word, you might want to make them leave the room at that point. So anyway, I hope you enjoy that all. Just to keep you in the loop, we do have some pretty great Ask Me Anything panels coming up on the Ask Historian subreddit. On the 29th, we have a panel on the Spanish Civil War. If you are a fan of the podcast, you may notice some of the names from our Spanish Civil War podcast, answering questions there. On December 6th, we're going to have a panel on East Asia in the early 20th century, so I hope you'll join in that. I'm very happy to say that I will be taking part in a panel on the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas on December 14th. That literally, we have people who can cover anything from the farthest tip of Alaska all the way down to the furthest tip of Tierra del Fuego, dealing with what happened before the Spanish or basically any Europeans arrived, and Europeans were the first. So don't ask us anything about Roman coins, and you can go ahead and ask us about Roman coins found in Ohio, and we'll just tell you how wrong that is. On December 20th, we have a huge panel on the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. Not the fall of the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic. And on December 29th, to round out the year, we're going to have a panel on Prussia. So hope you can come by and ask some questions about those topics then. In the meantime, though, enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ask Historians podcast. I am your humble host and interlocutor, 400 Rabbits. I'm here talking with Rakony, or better known as Joe, about the portion of the Mongol Empire that we know as the Ilkhanate. That's, and I'm sure he'll probably correct my pronunciation on many, many things as we go forward.
Don't worry about that. My own is probably quite bad. I mainly read these things. There's a lack of people to actually discuss them with and correct my pronunciation, so
yeah, well. Absolutely. So we'll be talking about that, and for those people who don't know, just the 30-second rundown is that this is the portion of the Mongol Empire that was in the kind of Central Asia, Persia, and into the Middle East. So Joe, why don't you go and tell us just how you got interested first in the Mongols and then in this particular portion of Mongol history?
Okay, well, so my first interest in the Mongols was actually a book I got by Jack Weatherford called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Many people might have actually heard of it. It was a bestseller a few years ago, so I believe. And it was a very enjoyable book to read because my previous experiences of Genghis Khan had been under books when I was younger, with titles like The World's Most Evil People or Tyrants, this being appealing to my 8-year-old self. But it gave me a very interesting alternative view on the Mongols. It talked about aspects beyond conquest and also aspects such as trade and cultural interchange, which has been a particular historical interest of mine. And then from there, my interest got the opportunity to blossom with an extended project at my school, which, for those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, it's basically you get It's an exam equivalent to AS level in Britain, where you write roughly 12,000 words on any subject you please. And I decided to do it on the Mongol Empire, and this is how my interest got going. And then, as for how it got down to the Persian aspect, it's quite simply because the books were more available on that aspect. And I'd also had previous interest in the Arab world. I'd read a few histories on that as well. So it all just sort of fitted quite nicely together for me.
Wonderful. So why don't you go ahead and give us a quick rundown of what we're talking about and who we're talking about when we talk about the Mongols and the Ilkhanate.
Okay, so most people are probably aware of the Mongol Empire. If you're on this sub, most people are aware of it. It was, in brief, the giant empire formed by Genghis Khan in a series of conquests, which led him starting in Mongolia into China, and then Central Asia, and then Iran, and also bits of the Middle East, also Russia, and even as far afield as Hungary, though they never really set up a permanent bases in that area. So it was the largest at its height. It was the largest single contiguous land empire ever. Now the Ilkhanate was a particular subsection of the empire. What happened is, as time went on, tensions built up within the empire, and it ended up splitting into roughly 4 areas. These were the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Central Asia, the Chathagids, which were Central Asia, slightly further east, also moving down into Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan sometimes. They're a bit smaller than the others. And then we have the Ilkhanate in Iran, but greater Iran, really. So this means that you have Iran, bits of Tajikistan, bits of Uzbekistan, bits of Turkmenistan, bits of Afghanistan, fair slice of Iraq, all of Azerbaijan, and also dominating nearby kingdoms such as Georgia. The Ilkhanate actually wasn't set up after the first Mongol invasion. The first Mongol invasion was sparked when Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to the Khwarazm Shah, who occupied the area that would later become the Ilkhanate. Unfortunately, the Mongol ambassadors merchants didn't get the best reception. The governor of Otrar executed them in a fine show of diplomatic spirit, of course. And then when the Mongols sent more ambassadors to the Shah asking, could you hand this guy over so we could punish him, or at least give some form of compensation, he further insulted them and in some records burnt off their beards and various other humiliations. So now you've just pissed off the Mongols, who placed a lot of emphasis on the sacrosanct personage of ambassadors. You weren't supposed to harm them, so you've now just pissed off a man who's conquered most of China. A bad move, as most people would think. So then you get a giant wave of invasions. You get the Khwarazm Shah collapse, completely, very, very fast, and the Shah himself fleeing across his dying realm until he ends up on an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died alone, broken and old. And actually now there's a shrine there because he's been made a saint. But anyway, that's beside the point. And this was the original area of the Ilkhanate, but the Ilkhanate was yet to be established at this point. What happens? Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to ask, because I think you're going to go into it. When do we see this actual establishment then of the Ilkhanate? Is there a set time?
Yeah, the Ilkhanate gets established when Hulagu gets sent along in. Give me a sec. Sorry, this is rather embarrassing for me. 1256. He gets sent along by his brother Monke. Okay, so why we come to the question, why was he sent here? Usually Mongol rule was relatively decentralized, or prior to this it had been relatively decentralized. The Mongols would rock up, they'd conquer everything, and then like the surviving elites who had had the good sense to surrender or who had somehow escaped being butchered or whatever, were more or less left in control of the territories, and above them you would appoint a Baskat, an official. These officials were alternately known as Baskaks or Daraguchis or Shanas. The terms are interchangeable, but sometimes they mean different things. This means Mongol history is hell at periods. But anyway, you have these people in these viceroy positions. But under the Monke, what we start to see is quite a few moves towards centralization. We also see quite a few moves towards reform, because corruption was pretty endemic. The main point up to this, the main idea of the Mongols up to this point was extort as much as we can from the sedentary populace. Now, Monkey was moving away from this into more of a sustainable tax base. So when the a Qadi from Iran, an Islamic judge, a very respected Islamic judge, turned up at the Mongol court in Karakorum complaining of the extortion and the corruption of the Mongol governor in the area, this seems like a great excuse for Monkey to sing along Hulagu.
And just to clarify kind of the familiar relationship here, Monkey was, I believe, the grandson of Genghis.
Yes, the grandson of Genghis. He was the son of Tolui being the youngest son of Genghis Khan.
And Hulagu was his
brother.
His brother? Okay.
And this played part of a role of why he was sent. So basically when Hulagu gets sent to the Middle East, you have basically three main goals. You have sort out the sort of like horrifying corruption and chaos that is the current government in the Iranian area. Secondly, expand conquests in the further Middle East to Syria, the areas that are now Palestine/Israel, Jordan, Egypt.
Did they have specific targets in this area aside from just like Egypt and Jordan, or did they say like this city, this area, this country, this kingdom, etc.?
I think the main Mongol tactic was you would rock up and keep conquering until you dropped. But no, the main target would, of course, have been the Mamluk forces in the area. And now we come to the third aim, which was a slightly unspoken aim, which was to shore up Toluid power. As we've mentioned earlier, Hulagu and Monkey were brothers, both Toluid princes from the line of the Tolui. And you see, Monkey's election as Great Khan had been a bit dodgy. So the process for choosing a Great Khan is that you'll call a Kurultai, which was all the notables of the Mongol Empire. They all gather together in the sacred soil of Mongolia, and they vote for the new Great Khan. The Great Khan must be from the Golden family. This is directly descended from Genghis Khan. So any direct descendant of Genghis Khan is in the running, as it were. And when Monkey gets elected, like, a lot of people favour him, but you also see a lot of opposition, particularly from the Ogadids and Chathagids. Ogedai being the third son of Genghis Khan and Chathagai being the second son. And a lot of them outright oppose it. Not only oppose this, but outright do not turn up for the election.
And was there a reason why Monkey was so unpopular?
To be honest, it's just struggles between different branches of the family for control of the empire. It's personal power politics playing here. And he had an alliance with the Jochids, who agreed to support him. They thought he had a decent chance of winning. Presumably, they thought that they didn't, so that he had their backing. But the Chathagids and the Ogadids were less pleased with this. So, as I said, a lot of them don't even turn up to the election, and this actually makes it quite dubious in terms of legitimacy, because if a lot of the people haven't turned up and you were supposed to have all the representatives of the line there, and he does manage to scrape together a few supporters from each of those families to turn up, but altogether a bit iffy. Anyway, so when he gets sending Hulagu to the Ilkhanate, to the area that would become the Ilkhanate, he's basically setting up, to rule over the area, he's basically setting up a new power base for the Toluid dynasty, somewhere to shore up his own personal power within the empire. So that was another unspoken reason to send him there.
And I guess also to kind of prove his legitimacy in the fact that, he was capable of making these, large annexations of territory and, diverting wealth, into Karakorum and such.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting that this is perhaps arguably the last campaign. Actually, it is the last campaign of the United Mongol Empire. You've got representatives from every family line being sent along, and every family line's got to contribute some troops, and they're all moving east. So yeah, it was an attempt to assert power, to move forward, and to keep up the impetus of conquest, which had kept the Mongol Empire going.
So the Mongols had already made incursions into Persia and I guess the Middle East as well, and the Caucasus in that region. So what were their main initial goals in going into this area? It's
quite simply further expansion. There's a lot of debate about why the Mongols keep expanding. I mean, obviously, more wealth, securing their own borders, because as mentioned, the Iranian area was slightly nebulous at the time. So they wanted to be secure their own borders against potential incursions from the Mamluks. And also there is quite a lot of interesting theory about Mongol ideas of universalism, ideas that they have the destiny to basically take over the world. So there's all these factors pushing the Mongols to just keep conquering and keep moving. And since the Middle East looks like a good area. It's rich. It's full of Muslims who they've conquered before. It's just another area to move on to.
And so when they were moving into this area, there wasn't really any, aside from the Mamluks, there wasn't really a major force that could oppose them, because there was still the I believe the Abbasid Caliphate as well.
Ah, yes, the Abbasid Caliphate, though once a mighty empire, less so now. Theoretically, the Caliph is the head of the entire Islamic world. He is the center of the Islamic world. He is descended from Muhammad, and everyone knows him allegiance. That's the theory. In practice, Baghdad had been in a very long decline by this point. So we've got they've been by this point they've already been occupied by the Seljuks. They've been occupied by the Fatimids at one point. They've been occupied by the Seljuks, and we see the area that they're relatively free actors at this point, but the area that they control is quite small. Baghdad is far from being at its height. Indeed, it's probably been, in fact, it has been eclipsed by other major cities in the Muslim world, such as Cairo in particular, Damascus. So when we say the Abbasid Caliph was there, he wasn't as big a threat as you'd think.
So it sounds like they had a relatively free run up into, into large portions of what we now call the Middle East. And I want to talk a little bit later about the decisive battles that kind of brought an end to that expansion. But if we could focus now on those areas that they did take over. So how far did they expand, and how did they kind of administrate these areas? Was it different than had been previously, or was it different from previous Mongol models, since they were going in to be kind of reform, corruption, and such?
Okay, so how far did they get into the Middle East? Not massively far. As you said, we're later going to discuss reasons behind of this. We're going to discuss Battle of Ain Jalut, and also other factors which meant they failed in later attempts at expansion as well. But they controlled, in the Middle East, the only area which is considered Middle East proper outside Iran that they controlled was areas of Iraq, sort of the border areas of Iraq and Syria, Turkey, that border modern-day Iraq. I mean, at one point they even lost control of Baghdad to the Mamluks. So their control in sort of the Arab Middle East wasn't actually that strong. But anyway, moving on to the territories which they did actually control. So the early system of the relatively decentralized rule continues for a while. We still see Baskaks / Daraguchi / Shanas. Let's just call them Baskaks. It's simpler for everyone. We still see those persisting in many areas. There are other areas which are under central control. So a mishmash persists. However, we do see actually some quite substantial reform. And I'm going to irritate everyone by going into the historiography of the subject, but it's actually quite interesting. So for a very long time, we actually took the view that when Hulagu arrived, things didn't change that much. The only thing that changed was the extortion continued, but perhaps the money was actually channeled to a central Mongol treasury, as opposed to in the pockets of whoever was nicking it. But this is mainly based on the account of Rashid al-Din. He was the chancellor under Ghazan, who was the fifth Ilkhan, yes. And he wrote a long history of the Mongols. It's a fascinating history, actually. It's actually known as the Universal History. It's one of the first attempts to write a history of the entire world. Anyway, when talking about the Mongols and the Ilkhanate, he writes at length about his own reforms and how wonderful they were and how necessary they were and how everything was going to the dogs before he just came in and sorted everything out. And he was the minister that had implemented all these reforms. So there was a bit of a conflict of interest when he was writing this. But because he was the best source we had to trust him. We had to take him at his word that the reforms which he had himself implemented were the things which saved everything and ended the corruption. There's been some very, very good research which has been overturning this. So particularly the research of George Lane and David Morgan. So David Morgan does very well in overturning this idea that the Mongols weren't involved, that they just appointed someone and then they left it alone. They didn't even necessarily appoint themselves. They appointed Uyghurs, they appointed Chinese, they appointed Central Asians. But there's been this idea that the Mongols themselves didn't administer things. This has been actually massively overturned. Mongols became very involved in government. We see active communication between the Khan and his ministers on a regular basis. We see the ministers travelling out to his camp / royal encampment / palace in Azerbaijan, which is quite a trek, to be honest. And if he wasn't involved, why were they doing this? We actually look at it. We see quite a few quite prominent Mongol ministers. We have Buka, who actually served as a vizier to Abaka, the second Mongol Ilkhan, and who launched some quite major reforms. And later we see Bolad Akka, who originally served in the Yuan dynasty, but travelled there as an ambassador, and then later became an advisor and administrator under Ghazan. So that's been overturned, so that we can see the Mongols increasingly involving themselves in government. So that's one change. I mean, even if it is just still in a relatively decentralized system.
So, but presumably there was a whole class and an entire class of indigenous Persian administrators, bureaucrats, petty nobles, etc., etc. How were they reacting to this kind of being? It wasn't like this was a new usurpation of their power, there having been previous conquests, but clearly it was a more extensive and more intensive usurpation of their power.
Well, no, not necessarily, because, as I said, Mongols did involve themselves increasingly, but there was still a very big role for Persian administrators. So we see the Javanese, who were an entire sort of semi-aristocratic and very bureaucratic clan, sort of taking over huge positions in the Mongol Empire. And later we actually see, under Ghazan, we see Rashid al-Din, despite some issues with his history. He was undeniably a very important minister, and he was actually of Jewish background, converted to Islam, but he was another native Persian who did very well. And Majd al-Mulk, another great example of a very important Persian, and we're going to be encountering him later, hopefully, when we talk about his feud with the Javanese. So, no, it was more a process of the meshing of the two words rather than sort of like a stamping on of a new administration. It was more of a mingling of the two worlds.
So how many Mongols do we actually have coming in and I guess settling in the area? Because it's the Mongols themselves are famously kind of a nomadic or really pastoral people. So were they still moving back and forth in between kind of Central Asia and into Persia, or were there actually, or did they establish themselves as more kind of sedentary rulers?
By this point, when the Ilkhanate is established, the Mongol Empire is more or less broken up. So we're not seeing the same great movement of Mongol peoples because we don't have the armies sweeping backwards and forwards. We do see a lot of Mongols turn up, mostly in the form of Hulagu, his personal retainers, the army that he brings with him, etc., etc. But the presence of how many Mongols you're to encounter in the street or in daily life very much depends on where you lived in Iran. For example, you see, the Mongols still continue to a certain extent to a few nomadic traditions. They still kept lots of horses. They were still very much based on cavalry, archery, etc., etc. So they set themselves up. Most of them set themselves up in Azerbaijan, where there was a lot of pasture. There was enough to keep their horses going. There was enough to feed them, enough to sort of keep up their traditional way of life, enough to indulge in their hunting, which was a massive part of Mongol culture. Whereas, so if you're in Azerbaijan or the northern bits of Iran, you're quite likely to bump into them. If you move into southern Iran, you're less and less likely to meet them. Or the Rumi areas in the Sultanate of Rum, which was sort of under Ilkhanate control, they're not very present there either. So whether you're going to meet a Mongol on the street depends on where you are in the Ilkhanate.
And do we see something like the setup of like the Forbidden City, like we have in the Yuan dynasty, in say major Persian cities, where there's kind of a Mongol self-segregated enclave?
Well, as I said, that's not really as necessary because they've all set the vast majority, the army and the family of the army, the family members of the army, they've all set themselves up in Azerbaijan mainly. So and most Mongols were actually either in the army or serving up in the civil service. So unless you're talking about like barrack areas in cities, we don't see much creation of sort of Mongol-only zones. We see quite a lot of intermarriage between them, between the local elites and between the Mongols. And as said, the vast majority of the Mongols weren't in areas where you see many Persians. They're all busy on the sort of grassy plains of Azerbaijan. So no, we don't really see sort of separate areas as much.
So we have the influx of these kind of new rulers who are kind of rearranging the political system, even while keeping large parts of it intact to use and exploit for their own aims. Typically, of course, this would come with some sort of interior upheaval and kind of, I guess you could say, internecine squabbling between the people whose political system has kind of been turned upside down. So do we see the rise of, you mentioned a couple families earlier, so Persian families earlier who actually made it quite well on the Mongols, but do we see these kind of political intrigues and struggles going on not only between Mongols and Persians, but also between Persian groups or between the Mongols themselves?
Yeah, we do. I can give you examples of actually all of those. Should we start between the Mongol groups? There's the obvious example of after Abaka, we get quite a lot of instability in the Mongol Empire, right up until in the Ilkhanate, right up until Kazan. So we see various Mongols setting themselves up as the Ilkhan, being overthrown, being murdered by other pretenders to the Mongol throne. And it's actually, there's some quite interesting politics all behind this. But so, yeah, no, we definitely see squabbles between the Mongols because they never really clarified who inherits the throne. Between Mongols and the current Persians, there's a fantastic example in Shiraz. It was an area which was one of the more autonomous areas that had the good sense to surrender. You had a Baskak there, and the local family was governing. Interestingly, the local sort of like head honcho, as it were, not the Baskak, the local aristocratic person in charge of the city, Persian aristocrat, was actually not that Persian. She was from Central Asia, and she was a woman known as Terken Khatun, who, despite being a woman, had done well for herself and come into charge of the city. But there's accounts from the city of really very grotesque corruption. We see attempts to cover it up. We see against Mongol investigators. We see subversion of Mongol Baskaks, so they end up sort of like representing the interests of the city to the Mongol court, as opposed to representing the interests of the Mongol court to the city. We even see Baskaks get murdered when they try to assert dominance of the Mongols. We actually see the army being brought in to bring in this wayward city into line 2-3 times, I think. And so, yeah, there's a lot of squabbling there, rather to the detriment of the people, really. They have the ruler been slightly less corrupt and slightly more competent, perhaps they would have done rather better, as there's a nice example of another city, which we can move on to. But so that's a squabble, but there's some nice squabbling between the Persians and Mongols, and between Persians and Persians. Now there's a fantastic political scandal here. So I've talked about the Javanese. So they did very well for themselves, and there were two very important Javanese. There was Shams al-Din Javani and there was Ata al-Malik Javani. And Ata al-Malik became governor of Baghdad, and Shams al-Din became in charge of revenue, more or less. He was a very important position in the court. Now, of course, being incredibly successful for themselves, they of course attracted a fair number of detractors, a fair number of jealous people, and the most important one is Majd al-Mulk, who was actually a previous protege of the Javanese. They had sort of taken him on, they'd sort of like lifted him up through their influence. They'd been his patrons in the system. But after this, he starts gaining his own power, and he starts to become rather jealous of the Javanese. So he starts making up all sorts of charges to try pull them down. So first one, Majd al-Muluk, he overheard another protege of Javani praising the Mamluk army, going, look, they're great, they're disciplined, it's quite impressive. And he tries to contrive this to make it look like the Javanese are saying this, and the Javanese are therefore very treacherous. And the poor guy who's overheard saying this is actually beaten in an attempt to try and extract a confession, but this fails, and he refuses to indict the Javanese of anything, and so this fails. But Majd al-Mulk, he's a determined guy. He's not going to let one failed beating stop him from pulling down a major family. So he keeps going. First of all, Shams al-Din has noticed what Majd al-Mulk is doing. He's mildly angry that this guy is trying to sully his good name, but he decides it's a lot easier just to buy the guy off. So what he offers him is he offers him a governorship of the area of Sivas. He offers him a lot of cash. Basically, look, we can still be friends. Stop trying to screw me over. Here's a nice present to try sweeten the deal for you. Unfortunately,
and actually, if I could just have you clarify for a second here what the role of the Javanese were. I mean, we've said that they had these kind of important, bureaucratic positions, but do they control territory? Do they have ancestral homelands or hereditary lands and such and such?
No, they were sort of a bureaucratic clan. They had a whole line of. They were from a long line of bureaucrats, and while that doesn't sound as impressive as it might, it is actually quite important. They'd served previous dynasties, and so they'd built up a fair amount of wealth, a fair amount of their own property. And both of them served different roles. So At al-Malik, as serving as governor of Baghdad, he controlled the territory. He he was in charge of bringing irrigation to these areas. He was in charge of taxation. He was in charge of everything, every bit of local governorship. Whereas, but he was also very active on a personal level. So he'd do things like found hospitals in the same place, or set up waqfs, which are large Islamic charitable institutions to look after the poor or the needy, or to pay for the upkeep of a mosque. And Shams al-Din, despite being a minister in charge of tax collection, so sort of less hands-on power to affect like the daily life of a city, does similar things. He sort of funds various charitable institutions, patronises scholars, artists, poets, etc., etc. But as mentioned, they're a bureaucratic clan, so of course that's the rub for them. They're rather dependent upon their positions in government.
They don't have the same intrinsic prestige that some other groups might have.
No, they're not. To take an example, they're not like a baron in the north of England who owns land and he is a feudal lord, and there are people who owe allegiance directly to him. No, that's a different scenario. They are dependent on the Khans, which is or whoever's ruling at that point, which is the issue. So
how did the offer of the governorship and the payoff turn out?
Rather badly. Majd al-Mulk, as opposed to just accepting the it was basically a bribe, as opposed to accepting the bribe as he should have, decided to use this to make allegations of corruption. Yes, to be honest, it was quite corrupt thing to do. And he makes this allegation against Shams al-Din, who's trying to buy him off. And Shams al-Din only survives by throwing himself on the mercy of Bakr's wife, Ulce Khatun, who favoured him, who had good relations with him. And she intervenes on behalf of Azmund, look, he's a loyal servant. We don't have to do terrible things to him. And so he survives. Majd al-Mulk continues because he is a persistent little bastard, and he's determined to pull the Javanies down. So, having tried his hand at Shams, who is Shams al-Din, he decides to have a go at the other brother, the governor of Baghdad. And in this, he has slightly more success, unfortunately. What happens is he alleges corruption again. And
probably because, of course, there was corruption.
Yes, there was corruption, but maybe not actually in this particular case, which makes it even more amusing, to be honest. So in a dark way, amusing in a dark way. So he alleges corruption again, and the Javani brother, despite denying this, he goes, look, it's just easier to pay off the supposed debt I owe, so just gives a bunch of cash. Unfortunately, Majd al-Mulk manages to convince the current Khan of Akka that actually, no, the corruption's been on a way bigger scale than this. We're seeing embezzlement on a huge scale. We've got to search his house. We've got to look for the buried gold. Got to look for the hidden wealth. And he gets his way on this. So he goes through his house. He nicks actual personal property from this house. He tortures servants going, where's the gold? Where's the gold? There probably isn't actually nearly as much as he's claiming. And he even goes as far as digging up the graves of the guy's relatives in case he's hidden the money there. So he digs up the guy's child's graves, which is a hideous thing to happen.
Now, do you actually think that Naj al-Mulk was firmly of the belief that there was hidden gold, or was this more of an intimidation tactic?
It was probably an intimidation tactic, to be honest. I mean, he might well have been hoping to find something, because, as we've said, everyone was probably mildly corrupt. So, I mean, in the way things were at that point. But the main thing is an attempt to drag the guy down. And, again, it fails, actually, because a lot of people apply... Again, they appeal on the behalf of this Javani. They go, look, he has also been a loyal servant to us. He has served us well. He has been a friend to me. He has been a friend to this person. All these Mongol notables, all these other important Persians pushing to get this guy pardoned. And it happens.
So did the rather heavy-handed tactics, like digging up a child's grave, did that have any effect, kind of like any backlash as well?
No, Majd al-Mulk still is doing well and gets promoted. Unfortunately, unfortunately for him, he is actually about to go too far, which makes you wonder what he's going to do. It's actually rather prosaic. This time he alleges treason against the governor of Baghdad, and he's gone too far now. There is not a shred of evidence against this. He claims that he's negotiating with the Mamluks to betray the Ilkhanate. No indication of this at all, and he goes too far. And as Javani is hurrying to the capital to try to clear his name, hears from Abaka, look, I found you completely innocent, there's no evidence of this, and Majd al-Mulk is going to be punished. And this seems marvellous to him. Unfortunately, Abaka then dies, and he briefly goes into prison, but even then, the successor, Tekodur, goes, look, okay, I'm convinced of your innocence as well, and he's freed. And Majd al-Mulk, now having exhausted his good name and his credit, and having harassed various supposedly loyal servants, or actually loyal servants in this case, was accused of witchcraft, which is a very serious offence for the Mongols. They do not like the idea of you casting spells on them or curses or whatever. So he is arrested and he's executed in a way. He's actually he's torn to shreds, actually, in a rather gory execution. And just to give an example to the rest of the empire, the various bits of his body are sent around the empire as an example of justice being done. And there's actually quite an amusing little poem about this, written by some rather cynical poet at the time. It's he wanted to stretch his hand as far as Iraq. His grasp never reached that far. His hand, however, did arrive there, which is quite bloody. I found quite funny, but in a dark way. And you think the saga's over now. You think that Majd al-Mulk is gone. No. He exacts revenge more or less from beyond the grave in this case. So Tegodur, he actually isn't doing that well. He gets overthrown by Argun. There's various political reasons behind this. And Argun is now actually quite suspicious of the Javanese, because before Majd al-Mulk has been executed in this delightful way, he was spreading more slander about the place, and he had claimed that that Shams al-Din Javani had actually poisoned Baka, and that he was responsible for his death. And then Argun's obviously suspicious about this. He wants an investigation, and then when he sees the Javanis serving Tegurud, who he's now currently in rebellion against, this suspicion grows a bit further. And while he can't get his hands on the brothers, he goes through the standard intimidation tactics, i.e. he digs up the grave of a good friend of the governor of Baghdad and throws it into the street as a "I'm coming for you" sign.
It's quite a lot of grave digging in this story.
Yeah, it's quite gory, isn't it? I'm not sure why they went for grave digging. Apparently it was the thing to do. Anyway, so he throws the body into the street to be eaten by the dogs and sort of clothes to be stripped off by beggars and so on, whatever. Massive humiliation. And his friend, the governor of Baghdad, after hearing this, dies, allegedly of stress and grief and just collapse, basically. And this is only after 8 months after Majd al-Mulk has died. And so that's quite sad. And then his brother, Shams al-Din, he's obviously nervous as well, and he considers fleeing the country. But he doesn't want to, because he has the vision of his family and children being held accountable for this, and he does not want that happening. So he decides to throw himself on the mercy of the Great Khan, of the Ilkhan, and at first it looks like this is working. Argun greets him actually quite warmly for a guy who's just driven his brother to death, but anyway. And there's signs that he might even be rehabilitated, move back into government, etc., etc. Unfortunately, close to Argun, well, unfortunately for Shams, the Mayor's advisors close to Argun were from other bureaucratic clans who disliked the Javanese. They remind him, oh, well, there's all these outstanding charges against him, you can't trust this guy, and convince him to execute Shams al-Din. Shams al-Din is allowed a few final moments with his family. He's allowed a few days to write out his will at some length. And then in 1280, he is executed. So, yeah, despite reform and actually despite the end of a lot of the more egregious exploitation on this period, which I could go into a bit later, and some of the restoration, the political climate still is quite turbulent, and there is still stresses in the system of personal power and personal politics.
So I actually want to return to something you mentioned earlier, the charge of witchcraft, because I think if people know about the Mongols, they know that they're kind of a polyreligious, almost kind of tolerant, particularly for the time period that we're talking about. In religious aspects, some over in China you could convert to Buddhism, or have hold Taoist beliefs. You could hold the traditional Mongol beliefs as well. There were Christian, there were Islamic. I believe actually some of the later Ilkhans actually converted to Islam, and there's some sort of tension between making it an official state religion. But can you talk a little bit about how this minority of Mongols amongst this kind of vast Persian and also Azerbaijani and all sorts of other ethnicities, it was kind of picked up some of those cultural aspects and kind of acculturated themselves into the more Persian lifestyle?
Okay, so yeah, give me one sec. Okay, Personalization. This is quite interesting. So yeah, this is across the entire Mongol Empire. We see adoption of local culture and local customs. So in terms of the Mongol Ilkhans, we see adoption of ancient Persian titles like Padishah, which roughly translate to emperor, and Shahanshah, which is king of kings, Shah of shahs. This is used as a tool of legitimization. Right? It's like, you can trust us. We're calling back to the ancient Persian loyalties, to the ancient Persian roots, and we also see other attempts to do this. So we see one of the biggest texts in Persian history is the Shahnameh. It was written by Ferdowsi, and it's history/myth compendium of the sort of like the glorious history of Iran, and the Mongols sort of commission. It was Argun commissions a version of this, which adds in the Mongol bits, the Shalmana-i Chingizi, which does the Mongol conquest, which does the arrival of Hulagu, which does his reign, and does the coronation of Oljetu as well, because it was completed after he was died. So we see big attempts to try legitimize themselves. And even like hard-bitten Mongol generals like Sukunjak become patrons of Persian arts. But what's interesting is this isn't necessarily a one-way street. We see influences on the Persians as well, not necessarily Mongol influences, but influences from the rest of the empire. And we also see, and arguably the Mongols played a big, in the simplest form, Mongols arguably played a big role in reviving Persian culture, in forging it as something really distinct from the rest of the Islamic world. So the Shahnameh, which was actually published in the 10th century, I believe, was sort of an attempt to reassert Persian identity. And it really goes through a boom under the Mongols. Two-thirds of the illustrated fragments we have of this book come from 1280 to 1350, which is the Mongol period, really. So we see them sponsoring Persian culture in a big way. We also see, I was talking about influences from the rest of the empire. So if we look at Persian miniatures, we see the influence of Buddhist and Chinese styles in the way of painting. And if we look at Rashid al-Din, the guy who served under Kazan, he was sponsored by the Mongols to write the Universal History, which I mentioned earlier. It was the first attempt to write the history of the world, or the entire known world at that point. And it heavily makes use of the fact of the existence of the Mongol Empire. So we have scholars from across the various bits of the empire, even though it was shattered, turning up, helping with research, contributing knowledge. We see unprecedentedly good knowledge of China in the Islamic world in this history. So really quite detailed knowledge. And there's even a history of the Franks, or which is what they call the Europeans. They have a history of Europe, which is a big innovation in the Islamic world, the idea that these Europeans deserve much attention. So we see that influence as well. And we also see an influence in the painting as well. We see in the paintings in it from that period, from some of the earliest texts, some which come from the Mongol period, the miniatures drawn in the margin. We see not just Persian styles, but Chinese and Buddhist styles, already mentioned, but also Byzantine styles, and even influences from Sienese styles from the city of Siena in Italy. So it's not just the barbarians succumbing to a superior culture. It's the barbarians they're playing a role in changing the culture they've come into as well. And
the idea of the kind of Pax Mongolica, allowing the interplay of all these ideas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually, I find that kind of an interesting idea because I think, going back to the whole idea of, the Mongols being portrayed as these, barbaric tyrants who come in and destroy everything, often you will hear that, why did the Islamic Golden Age come to an end? And one of the, reasons that's often cited is that the Mongols went in and they sacked Baghdad and took the house of learning that was there, or the house of wisdom, and threw all the books in the river, and
the river ran black with ink, all of that stuff.
Yeah. So how does that fit into our idea of these, of ideas coming from far away as China and Italy coming and intermingling in this, reviving Persian culture?
Well, it's partly because the Mongols weren't averse to brutality in their conquest. They had an entire policy of massacring populations that resisted as a way to spread terror, and armies that faced them would be terrified of the Mongols. Their morale would be low, they'd be easy to defeat, and some cities would just outright surrender, just knowing, look, if we resist and we fail, we're all dead. Easier to just go with the flow and surrender. So the Mongols deliberately cultivated a reputation for brutality in some ways, and also the Mongol invasions were a massive, massive psychological shock to the Islamic world, because in Islamic thought, it roughly divided the world into two areas. You've got the Dar al-Islam, which is the home of Islam, which is the home of enlightenment because it's the home of their religion, and you've got the Dar al-Harb, which is the home of strife, which is everywhere, which is un-Islamic, which is just barbarous, destructive. And the train of thought was that the Dar al-Islam would eventually expand to take over the entire world, because that was manifestly God's will. So when you've got a bunch of stinking barbarians who aren't even Muslim smashing through the Islamic world, slaughtering cities, and defeating everyone who stands before them, this is a huge shock to the psyche. So we actually get the writings of the time they are apocalyptic. We've got the idea that these are invaders from hell. They are heralding the end of days, that they're lost tribes of Israel. They look at lost tribes of Israelites come to destroy things, etc., etc., etc.
Well, I mean, to be honest, though, has there ever been any group in history that has not been, claimed to have been a lost tribe of Israel?
Yeah, the Christians claimed this was a lost tribe of Israel as well, and like the Mormons have claimed, I think the Native Americans are lost tribes of Israel.
Multiple people claim that, yes.
Yeah, no, but they were basically, get the idea of how the Islamic world was reeling and trying to work out what the hell was going on, and also how shocked they were. So, and also the apocalyptic state of mind that they were in. So at this point, there's a lot, everything that gets written about the Mongols by the Arabs, who use a lot, and indeed by most people who the Mongols have conquered, goes on about their destruction a lot. So, of course, we get this image of, and then this fits into the rhetoric that they destroyed Baghdad and they destroyed all wisdom because they are barbarians and they know nothing, so they're just going to burn the books and destroy everything. Actually not that true, necessarily. I've already mentioned how Baghdad was no longer at its height. It wasn't actually the centre of scholarship that it once was, so when it was destroyed, we aren't losing some invaluable resource, and even if even if it had been, it's sort of a Library of Alexandria fallacy that you destroy one center and, oh my God, we've got the Dark Ages. No, bad history will shout at you for that one. So no,
I'm sure there's a chart somewhere that explains this.
Yes, there is. Oh God, not the chart. Basically, actually, when they destroyed Baghdad, yes, there was widespread destruction of some areas, but the idea that they threw all the books into the river and such like, that's hearsay. And indeed, we've got proclamations by the Mongols which they sent to the city, and this is recorded even by some historians who absolutely hate the Mongols, saying that Hulagu, when he was besieging Baghdad, sent messages in saying, any scholar, any priest, you shall not be harmed, you shall survive, for I value you as men of religion, men of learning. And indeed, that some of them do. Ibn Jawas, a very prominent Shia scholar, survived the sack of the city and came out on the other side, and I believe even got given a fair amount of patronage by the Mongols. I'm not actually sure on that, so maybe he moved elsewhere.
So that's that's actually a little interesting point that, or at least the little mention of the Shia there made me think that. So did the Mongols put themselves in the middle of this the Shia Sunni divide, and was that even more prominent when later Ilkhan's converted to Islam?
They don't play politics with the Sunni Shias that much. I mean, that when they're conquering Baghdad, they do actually get a fair amount of Shia support. We've got, because they're destroying the centre of Sunni Islam, so some Shias are rather excited by this thought.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever the Persian word for schadenfreude is.
Yeah, so more than schadenfreude, there were 3 towns who threw a celebration and invited the Mongols over. Yeah, there's that. But as you mentioned, the Mongols had a policy of religious tolerance. I mean, there's various debates for this reason. They might be that they just found it easier. It was easier just to integrate a gigantic empire if you weren't trying to impose one religion. Or there's also the argument they were sort of hedging their bets on a cosmic scale, because they don't know quite which god is real, and their shamanistic beliefs mean they're quite syncretic. They can respect power in whatever form, so they're not sure which god is right. So whatever, just let them all go, and we'll cross off it, and we're sure that God will be fine with that. So they don't actually play politics with the Sunni-Shia divide that much. Even after they convert, yes, we see persecution of Buddhists in the Ilkhanate, but no, there's not any particular move against the Shias.
Was there a particular reason for the persecution of Buddhists?
It's because Islam has Islam considers Jews and Christians as people of the book. Yeah. People of the book. So there's inbuilt things for them. So after the conversion of Ghazan to Islam, that was the formal Islamization of the Ilkhanate. We do see actually reintroduction of a supplementary tax on Jews and Christians, but that's it. On the other hand, the Buddhists, they aren't people of the book, and indeed they look like they are polytheists in the eyes of Islam. They're idol worshippers. So at that point, you can't extend the same tolerance to them.
Yeah, they're outside that Abrahamic system.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why we see the persecution of the Buddhists.
I think what I want to move on to now is actually talking about what we touched on earlier, but is the actual and what we touched on a couple times here and there is the actual kind of bloody advance of the Mongol armies, and particularly how they got stopped, because we do tend to think of the Mongol war machine as being basically unstoppable. The whole idea that if they hadn't been called back to go to a Kurultai, then all of Europe would now be speaking Mongol. Although that's an urban exaggeration, but but it seems like they got pretty soundly defeated by the Mamluks. So could you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, so I suppose the logical place to start is the Battle of Ain Jalut, which was when the Mamluks first defeated a Mongol army. And so I'm just going to go through the circumstances that led up to that battle and what happened during the battle and why the Mongols were defeated in that particular instance. And after that, I'm going to discuss what went wrong later and why they still couldn't advance. So, Battle of Ain Jalut. So, first thing that's happened is it's actually like Europe. The Great Khan has died. Monkey has died, so Hulagu must go back. He must go back and participate in the Kurultai. He might want to try to become Great Khan himself, and even if that's not, he needs to know who he's going to back in the election. So he heads off taking a large part of his army with him because these affairs were becoming increasingly tense. So while it was all very well to go and vote, it was good to vote with sort of like 50,000 hairy horsemen behind you. And so he goes back and he leaves a small force of 1 or 2 Tumens in the area. So that's 10 to 20,000 Mongols. Doesn't sound that small, but compared to what he had before, it was quite small. They've moved, and you've got to also keep in mind that these guys have been fighting for quite a while now. They've been moving through the Middle East. They'll be tired. They'll have incurred losses. And anyway, they've actually retreated north into Galilee, just sort of like the area of northern Syria, sort of southeastern Turkey, where they can rest and recuperate. And they think that they're safe because if the Mamluks want to reach them, not just the Mamluks, but also Baibars, who was a Arab, not exactly warlord, he's kind of difficult to describe his position. If they want to get through them, they have to move through areas controlled by the Crusaders, by the Christian states in the area. And they think there's no way in hell they're going to do this. There's no way in hell the Crusaders would let them. They kind of miscalculate on this point. The Crusaders, upon seeing the Mongols, well, originally there was hopes that they were the great Christian king of the East, Prester John, come to destroy Islam. This sort of fades rather rapidly. So they collectively shit a brick. And they come to the conclusion that while the infidel must be suppressed, and while we really hate the Muslims and really need to retake the Holy Land and all that stuff, we can sort of let them pass through our land and even at one point camp under the walls of one of our cities if they're heading towards to attack the Mongols. So the Arabs have moved through Crusader lands, much to the surprise of the Mongols, and they come across the Mongols, who are relatively unprepared. I mean, the Mongol armies were usually flexible, quite fast-moving, but still it's a disadvantage, and they don't really know about the disposition of the forces, etc., which is an issue for them in the battle, actually, as we still see. So how do the Mamluks manage to defeat them? Well, as we've said, they're a smaller force, they're a tired force, but also the Mamluks deploy some really excellent tactics. So they use a smaller force under the command of Baibars, the guy I mentioned earlier, to harass the Mongols, to sort of like irritate them, to launch small hit-and-run attacks, and sort of like generally be a gadfly and hard to pin down. And then they look like they're retreating, and the Mongols are like, okay, let's go smash these guys. They all charge forward. And they charge, and unfortunately, this is a trap. This takes them into an area where they're surrounded on all sides by the Arab armies who have the high ground. And then this turns into a rather bloody battle. It's sort of like swords clash, arrows fired, blood spilled, etc., one key stage. But they also then suffer the terrible thing of the Syrians have defected. The Syrians who formed part of their forces have defected, deciding that for some reason they didn't like the Mongols and they'd prefer to side with the Mamluks, who were at least Islamic and not howling barbarians in their eyes. So that goes badly for them. But even then, the Mongols almost break out, but they don't. And eventually the Mamluk line holds firm, as according to the records, the Mamluk leader himself charged in, shouting "For Islam" to steady the line, and the Mongols are beaten at Ain Jalut. And that's a serious reverse for them.
And what kind of forces are we looking at here? Because I know this often the battle, conflicts between the Mamluks and the Mongols often get touted as the reason the Mamluks were so successful is because they too were kind of these horse archer cavalry kind of armies.
Probably helped, to be honest. I mean, large foot armies tended not to do particularly well against the Mongols. The Mongols were very, very mobile. They were very, very proficient with their bow. Their bows were very, very good. They tend to be very well armoured as well, actually, fit for the purpose. I mean, light armour, but good quality stuff. So, yeah, certainly Mamluk mobility would have helped them. But actually, we can actually go. It's not just that why the Mongols don't really manage to conquer them successfully later on. We do actually see many attempts by the Ilkhans to conquer the Islamic lands, and actually in 1281, Abaka got as far as Homs, and then later on, I believe it was Argun even took Damascus at one point. But each time they were forced back by factors beyond their control, and it's the same factor each time. This is and this is a major impediment to Ilkhanate expansion. It's the fact that the Chatagid Khanate and the Golden Horde by this point are hostile. They're hostile powers. The Golden Horde is even allied with the Mamluks by this point. And so each time when they've taken these cities, attacks by the Chatagids or the Golden Horde force them to move back to defend their homeland, allowing the Mamluks to move back in and reassert their dominance. And one other big limiting factor for the Mongols in sort of a macro strategic term, in big strategic terms, is supply issues. So the Mongols, I mean, you've probably people who sort of like Mongol enthusiasts like to go on about how Mongols sort of like they managed to travel so fast because they didn't have giant baggage trains and they were such a mobile army because they were all horse-mounted and they could survive off the blood and milk of their horses, etc., etc. And yes, this was true, and they were incredibly impressive in some ways. But you need to bear in mind they had a lot of horses, as in 4 to 5 horses per warrior in some cases, and you need to feed the horses. This is an issue. Like, I mean, when you're in Central Asia and when you're in northern China and when you're in Russia, this isn't really an issue. There's a lot of plains. The horses can eat grass. A guy can't eat grass, but the horses can, so they all survive really well. Once you move into the Middle East, this is the provisioning the just sheer number of horses there is a big issue, and so it's very hard for the Mongols to mount a sustained campaign in this area, or because either they're going to have to sacrifice mobility and bring along a bunch of fodder for the horses, or they're not going to be able to stay there very long, and they're going to have to conquer things quickly. So that's another big limiting factor on the Mongols, and this is actually argued to be, there's an interesting map on this, this is also argued to be a factor in why they actually withdrew from Hungary, or why they didn't go back to Hungary after the Kurultai. So that was another big issue of why they could never really move into the Mamluk areas.
So, but they did make other incursions, as you mentioned. So were there any other very notable conflicts? You mentioned the taking of Homs. Even if they were kind of, they had to, retreat back to watch their back. But do we have, battles as notable as Ain Jalut?
I don't think any of them have the same. Okay, firstly, I'm going to admit I'm not as strong as I should be on the military side of things. So perhaps incredibly as informed as I should be on this area. But no, there are no battles which have the same sort of like symbolic significance as Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut is the first time that sort of the Mongol armies in the Middle East hit against something which they can't move. So I don't think there's no battle which is as famous as Ain Jalut, as it were.
And so for their relationships with the Chagatai and the Yuan, and I guess even the Golden Horde as well. So how did that change? So you already said that that affected the fact that these other groups were hostile. That you no longer had a united Mongol empire, but you rather had these kind of splintered hordes, I guess you could say, or sub-states within it. How did those relationships change? Were there particular groups that were Mongol groups that were amenable and friendly with the Ilkhans? Were there particular groups that were always on their bad side?
Yeah, well, actually, a good way to discuss this is we'll look at what sort of used to hold the Mongol Empire together, and then sort of what was missing then. And I'll also, but first I'll give a quick outline of the basic relations. You can usually assume that they were allied. The Ilkhanate was always on good terms with the Yuan dynasty in China. The fact that they were both the Toluyid dynasty played a role of this, and the fact that the Jochid Golden Horde and that the Ogadid/Chatagid, Chatagid mainly, but then there's the Ogadids playing sort of their own game, and the Chatagid themselves. Anyway, beside the point. The fact that these two groups are hostile to both the Yuan dynasty and the Ilkhanate means that the alliance sort of cements that these groups. You could say the Mongol Empire split into 4 bits, but there's 2 main alliances within that, and the most of the time there's hostility between the Golden Horn and the Chatagids and towards the Ilkhanate, and friendliness from the Ilkhanate towards the Yuan dynasty. And actually, the Yuan dynasty is quite weird and interesting. Well, not weird. It's sort of oddly complex in some ways, because so despite the fact the Ilkhans are in reality independent rulers of this area, The fact that they backed, in the original civil war, which split up the Mongol Empire, they backed Kublai Khan in his claim against Arik Bokeh. The Jochid, Golden Horde, and the Chatagid Horde backed Arik Bokeh. They backed Kublai Khan. And so this meant they were still acknowledging his elevation to Great Khan. So technically, they're subordinate to him, and indeed the very title, Il-Khan, means sort of sub-Khan, subordinate Khan, Khan who is below, Khan who owes allegiance to someone. This actually continues to play a role in their politics. So when Abaka, the second Il-Khan, ascends, he makes a big show of sending emissaries to Kublai Khan, who's still alive at this point. He outlives quite a few Il-Khans, actually. So he sends emissaries to him going, could you confirm me in my role as Il-Khan? And a few years later, the emissaries come back, bearing sort of like symbols of kingship, and officially proclaim him Il-Khan. And so this dependence actually continues for a while. But actually, the next Il-Khan tries to move away from this. Ahmad Tekudur tries to assert some independence. If we can see this at the coinage at the time, so we see a lot of coins are struck, not in the name. Previously, all the coins had been inscribed in the name of the Great Khan in sort of like Kublai. He starts inscribing the Khans in the name of the Sultan Ahmad, his Islamic name being Ahmad Tekudur. So yeah, and so that's an assertion of independence. They mainly actually strike these in Islamic areas. In areas where it's actually Christian or less Islamic, they still continue using the Great Khan's name. But anyway, we see he moves towards independence, and also he doesn't send for confirmation, unlike Abaka. This actually backfires on him quite hard. Arghun rebels against him. There's other reasons for this. There's personal politics, but he also gains. It's been theorized he also gained the backing of some of the more conservative members of the Mongol aristocracy, who weren't all too keen with breaking the idea of allegiance to the Great Khan. And so Arghun overthrows him, and when he overthrows him, Arghun makes a big show of subordination to the Great Khan. He goes through the same rigmarole as Abaka. He sends for the emissaries there. He goes, confirm me as Great Khan, please. And then when he's writing diplomatic letters to the Mamluks or even to Europe, he still refers to himself as subordinate to the Great Khan in Asia. Actually, but after him, we see attempt to shift away here. This is Geikatu. We see the start of using coins again. We see the same moves as Tekudur used, sort of striking coins in the name of someone in the name of Geikatu, as opposed to in the name of Kublai, who is still alive in China, despite having outlived 4 Il-Khans by this point. And he does that, but at the same time, there's still the use of the Great Khan's name in other things, so this is sort of an in-between period. And then Kublai dies, finally, in 1294, I don't know his exact date of his death, because since Ghazan ascended in 1295, he might have even outlived 5 Il-Khans, which is truly an impressive feat, but he's finally dead, which further weakens the bonds, because he was the last guy officially proclaimed Great Khan, even if it was very dodgy and the thing that split the Mongol Empire apart. And Ghazan further weakens the ideas of subordination now. He continues the trend of striking coins in the name of the Il-Khan, not in the name of the Great Khan, except in Christian areas. But even by the end of Georgia, even by the end of his reign, even in Georgia, he's referring to himself as the Sultan of the Ilkhanate on the coins, and no reference to the Great Khan. So then this trend continues, and while they remain allies at this point, they still remain allies. The idea that the Ilkhanate is somehow subsidiary to the Great Khan in China is gone by that point.
So there's another political and military and cultural force that we've kind of touched on with the Battle of Ain Jalut, and that would be the Franks, the Europeans and the Crusaders that are in the area. And one of the things that struck me as very interesting while I was doing kind of my background research for this episode was the fact that there seemed to be this ongoing attempt to ally the Mongols and the Crusaders, and really even just parts of European kingdoms together that never seemed to get off the ground. And we had a little bit of a chuckle about the idea that Hulagu was the Prester John or something like that. But these attempts continued. So what were their goals here? Was it just uniting commonly against the existing Muslim kingdoms and empires, or was there something greater? And what stymied it continually?
That certainly was a big thing. The idea that they had a common enemy in the form of the Mamluks. And sort of the Mongols sent letters going, yeah, you help us, we help you, you get some of the Holy Land, deal. That's an idea. And there are multiple attempts to get off the ground and various reasons why it doesn't. Mainly each time personal politics intervenes, either in the Ilkhanate there's instability which undermines things. Okay, and in the case of, I think, in the case of Edward II or Philip IV, just local circumstances meant that they couldn't commit to a crusading effort. And also the crusading spirit, was sort of on the wane on Europe. This would have been like Edward II when he was prince. He had a brief attempt. I think he landed in the Holy Land with a few thousand soldiers in what's known as the Ninth Crusade, though some don't really count it because he landed there, sort of rocked around, fought a few battles, and then he had to leave, and little was achieved in the end. So there was a failure of coordination each time. They found it difficult to sort of mesh together for such great differences, and it was, as I said, homeland politics intervened to make things difficult to cooperate.
And were there apprehensions amongst the Europeans with working with the Mongols? Because of course these are another pagan, heretic, non-Christian group as well.
Well, no, actually, having moved away from the delusion that the Mongols were some great Christian force, they sort of moved back towards it. And they began to become very interested in converting the Mongols, because there were prominent Mongols who were Christians, Nestorian Christians, which was an eastern branch of the church, which technically would have got them condemned for heresy by the Catholics. But hey, there are Christians. Clearly, they can make an effort.
Close enough.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of interest in making an effort. And indeed, we look at publications from the time. So sort of talking about how the Mongols, they're so just and they're so powerful. And indeed, there's this idea that they favour the Christians. So this just might have them mistaking tolerance for favouring them, because they don't quite get the idea of sort of co-equal religious groups in Europe at this period in time. And there's even I think it was a German book. I've got its name written down somewhere. I can't see its name. Okay, it's a German book published in 1298, talking about with the story of how actually the Mongol Khan has been converted to Christianity because he had a monstrous son, and after the child was baptized, it was magically healed and became a beautiful normal baby, and he's baptized. Of course, this is utter cobblers. It's complete lies. But the Christians believe this, or if some of them believe this, or if they don't believe this, they still hold high hopes. Even after the Ilkhans have converted, they hold sort of the ideas of an anti-Muslim, anti-Mamluk alliance. And weirdly, you sort of wonder if they haven't actually noticed that they've converted, because when Edward II sends a message to Oljetu, this is the Khan after the Ilkhan after Ghazan, so Oljetu is firmly Muslim. Edward II writes about, I think, the barbarous sect of the Mohammedans, Oljetu being a member of this barbarous sect. So they still try to keep the alliances going off the ground, and they still try to keep converting. In 1318, they've set up an archbishopric in Ilkhanate city. So they managed to get over this. There wasn't that much apprehensions. It was, come on, we can convert these guys, we can get them, we can use them to conquer the Holy Land. Slightly,
slightly optimistic, and clearly didn't work. So, but I think that brings us to the topic of what happened to the Ilkhan, or to the Ilkhanate. What finally brought down this kind of overarching, hegemonic, established, political and military force in the region? It's something we've seen before. It was internal instability.
After Abaka, we see a lot of instability, which is this actually quite astounding with the ascension of Ghazan, and we see stability again for a while. But then they never really set up a formal system of inheritance. There's never primogeniture like in Europe, or it's sort of like vaguely elective, the succession. And this always means tensions, and eventually there's a rebellion which splits the empire apart. And I've seen theorizing that it could have even survived a bit longer had this not happened, but theories, we shall never know. There's also discussion about sort of things which undermined the success which the Ilkhanates had originally depended on. There's discussion of how the Mongol Khanates, which continued to exist in the sort of Central Asian areas, where there was lots of steppe, where they could keep up a more nomadic lifestyle, tended to be more successful. More successful in the sense they lasted longer. This is like the Golden Horde and the Chatgids. So yeah, again, we see this is again a theory. So we see potentially it was just the sort of the power which the Ilkhans had originally based themselves on slowly erodes, and we've got internal instability, and the empire falls apart.
And so presumably it hung on as kind of, fractured states. But, at this point, I think most people don't associate, Iranian or Persian history with the Mongols. So what is kind of the legacy that is left of them?
Not a huge amount, to be honest. I mean, I've talked about in the bit where we're discussing Persianization and acculturation and all that. I've talked about how there were influences which moved into the Persian area, and these still remain to a certain extent. There's sort of pottery and art and poetry and such like. Popularity of Sufism, though I think this later declines. These remain, but of the Mongols themselves, of Mongol culture itself, not a huge amount. I mean, quite interesting, as I mentioned way back when in this podcast about Mongols were slightly more liberal towards women. They were more okay with letting them have power. This too disappears. I've seen an interesting discussion of how you can track the slow disappearance of Mongol influence in the treatment of women in politics, and how their power fades. And as of the Mongols themselves, as I said, they've left traces, but they haven't left a Mongol stamp. It's not like the Arab invasions which came into the Middle East, which brought an entirely new language and a new religion. The Mongols, they brought themselves, they brought some armies, they brought influences from elsewhere, they brought to a certain extent their own culture, but they never managed to imprint it in the same way.
Well, Joe, thank you very much for talking with us today about this lesser-known subject of the Mongols. Do you have any final concluding remarks you want to leave us with?
I feel I should. I mean, there's been bits and pieces which I'd still like to chat about. So anyone who sort of wants to talk to me, I've still got stuff to say about administration. Anyone who's still curious about that, and about, I mentioned sort of like exploitation going down over time, feel free to ask questions about that. Anyone who's interested in the Mongols, I'm happy to recommend you books. But just in the end, thanks very much for letting me do this podcast. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure as well. And we could put up, in the discussion post, we can put up some links to some of the books. And if anyone has further follow-up questions, they can get you there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So bye. Thanks very much for doing this.
And I hope you enjoyed the show as well. Again, just a reminder, we'll be following up with the Mongols on the eastern side of the Mongol Empire with the Yuan dynasty and the Mongols in China and thereabouts in 2 weeks on our next episode. In the meantime, please do rate and review us on iTunes, or tell people who might be interested in history. And if you have any topics or suggestions that you'd like to see us cover, we do pull from our Flare pool of qualified users on Ask Historians, or occasionally we reach out to professional historians who are not part of our little community. But if you do want me to start bothering someone to get them on the show, please let me know. In the meantime, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.